Heaven's Vault is a game that I just can't get out of my head. It doesn't have the most complicated story or the most addicting gameplay, but when I think about games that gave me something I didn't even realize I wanted, games that may not be the most polished but have such passion that you don't mind, Heaven's Vault is front and center. I've played many games set in historical settings. Some use it as set dressing, some delve into the culture, events, and impact of the times. Both valuable approaches for what is being attempted. But Heaven's Vault is the first and only time that I've played something that really embodies the descriptor, "it's about history." What I mean is that this story answers several overarching questions that I believe to be at the center of historical study. Why do we study history? And how do we use or apply our knowledge of history? Or, put another way, how does the past affect our present and future? Heaven's Vault is a 2019 release from indie company Inkle, which was later adapted into 2 novels released in 2021 by the game's writer, John Ingold. Founded in 2011 and based in Cambridge, Inkle seems to be most well known for their development tools. Inkle Writer, released in 2012 and closed in 2018, was used to create interactive fiction, and was even used in some schools, winning, alongside other programs, an award for Best Websites for Teaching and Learning in 2013 from the American Association of School Librarians. Ink is their current text encoding system that can be implemented into game engines. It has its own subreddit, so I assume that means it's pretty cool. But these development tools are only half the story. Throughout the 2010s, Inkle began releasing interactive text-based adventure games, culminating in a massive step forward in resources and ambition with Heaven's Vault, a semi-open 3D adventure game using 2D character models, with puzzle solving centering almost entirely around language translation. You play as orphaned archaeologist Aliyah Elazra, a student at the University of Iox, which is on the moon of Iox. Moons are essentially mini-planets connecting to others via floating rivers of water. This collection of rivers and moons is called the nebula. People get from one moon to another in the nebula by sailing using various different kinds of ships. I would basically describe it as water navigation in space. Aliyah was brought to Iox around 17 years ago by her adoptive mother, Professor Lexi Miari, and since then has latched onto exploring ruins and unknown rivers, all the while serving as a translator in search of understanding the past. In the present, Miari sends for Aliyah and tasks her with finding missing roboticist Janiqui Remba. Miari previously sent Remba out searching for something. She won't explicitly say what that something is at first, but it soon becomes evident that while finding Remba is part of the task, the real interest is whatever he was sent out to find, as Remba has sent back a magnificent eagle-shaped brooch that intrigues the professor. Miari also gives you a robot to keep track of you and assist with navigation, a robot that Aliyah names Six, and you'll learn fast that this name is as cynical as it sounds. What starts as a search for a missing person turns into a journey across increasingly aged sites to find answers regarding a mysterious place known as Heaven's Vault. I don't think I'm spoiling anything there. As you travel, Aliyah finds various artifacts and architecture inscribed with the glyph language of Ancient. Ancient was once spoken and written by people all over the nebula, and as such can be found absolutely everywhere, but has long since been replaced by Ioxian. As I said, the core gameplay focuses on language translation. Ancient consists of 46 separate glyphs that each represent different nouns, numbers, possession, if a word is a verb or not, and so on. Starting off by using context clues from the environment, and what the object you're holding is and does, Aliyah can start by piecing together some basic words and phrases like God or water. When your rough translations fit sensibly into multiple different sentences and phrases, then the game will confirm your translation. But if Aliyah notices the words just aren't fitting, then it helpfully crosses out your incorrect translation. After the first few words are confirmed, you can center in on the glyphs themselves. For example, 2 curved lines indicate that the word is an action. There are very few games with language translation as a core mechanic, and of the few that I've played, I think Heaven's Vault has the most engaging puzzles. The game gives you enough space to exercise your brain, really work out the logic and prevent haphazard guesswork, but has enough of a safeguard to not be completely overwhelming. I'm not going to dive into this further because I'm not a linguistics expert, and there are pre-existing videos that do a far better job than I could describing the design of Ancient. I'll link these in the description for anybody interested. Similar to the language mechanics, the game's overall pacing gives players space to navigate. While the setup and conclusion of the game are fairly linear, the entire adventure leading up to that allows you to explore moons in whatever order you want, as long as you have the means of access. This makes repeat playthroughs refreshing, despite it being such a story-focused game. Furthermore, it really surprised me just how much consequence some of these decisions have on the characters around you and how you experience the game. For example, 6 will follow Aaliyah's commands, but it ultimately answers to Miyari, and will report any significant finds you make. However, if the player ensures 6 is elsewhere when pocketing an artifact or making a general discovery, 6 will not report on the finds. There are some aspects of the gameplay that don't really click for me. For every great thing I'm going to say later about world design, sailing through the nebula to those areas is nowhere near as engaging. You can choose different paths to go down, and occasionally find floating, ruined structures that 6 can retrieve miscellaneous artifacts from. But aside from that, there's no extensive player input. In the books, Aaliyah describes the struggle of sailing, how her arms are pulled this way and that as her ship is thrown in the icy rush of the waters. Reading that makes me wish there was more resistance to player movements, or interactive unfurling of the sails, or perhaps more debris that the player could attempt to avoid. As it stands, you're more so just waiting to reach your next destination, so much so that an option was added after release to hand the reins to 6 and skip the sailing sections entirely. Dialogue is conveyed through speech bubbles. Sometimes Aaliyah will monologue to herself, and this is voice acted, but that is the only exception. This is fine on its own, but can become confusing because the only way to note who's speaking is through the speech bubble's tail protruding from the characters. This is specifically a problem when you're sailing. You can't see the characters, so multiple speech bubbles will come out of the ship, and the only way to know the speaker is if you're familiar with their typical sentence structure. This means that if you're focusing more on sailing, some conversations can become a little confusing, but I'd be lying if I said this was a major issue. Finally, the game uses autosaving to lock in your progress. These saves are frequent, it almost always avoids making you retread events. However, sometimes it can feel a little punishing, as you can't change the outcome of any choice you've made without replaying the game entirely. I'd call this more a matter of design choice. There's nothing wrong with encouraging player experimentation and using the consequences of your decisions to increase replay value. Inkle's newest release, A Highland Song, also utilizes this saving system, further suggesting it being an intentional choice by the developers to make sure players experience as much of the game as possible. I just thought it worthwhile to note because I normally like to experience most of what a game has to offer on my first playthrough, and I know others probably feel the same. I believe all of these are pretty minor issues, nothing that really stops you from playing the game. The core game mechanic of language translation, what you'll be spending most of your time doing, is satisfying and interesting. Alongside that, the writing is just good, and that does a lot of heavy lifting. There's a reason this game can be adapted into companion novels, and it's just impressive to create an original world for your story that naturally captures people's interests. I was hooked on the political, religious, and geographical history of the nebula from the minute I first started playing. I would be remiss if I neglected to mention the world design, specifically the architecture of the nebula and its influences. In a game with a millennia-spanning history, all of the locations you go to look like they're from separate time periods. And I feel a large part of that is because there's evidently inspiration being drawn from multiple cultures and time periods of our own. Pueblo and cliff dwellings, medieval Islamic temples. I even get modern modular home vibes from Iox. I'm thinking the Sheriffia house, and I'm sorry, I know I probably just butchered that pronunciation. The soundtrack to the game is also excellent. I've been playing it in the background of this video with permission from the composer Lawrence Chapman. One of my favorite tracks, Before the Fall, features elegant piano and cello work that embodies the fascination of picturing days gone by. I would say the soundtrack generally keeps this level of serenity, but in a track like The Last Emperor, I can almost hear the ghosts of the past in its somber tone. When Aaliyah arrives on Iox at the start of the game, she remarks that all history begins from a single event, and what's the first thing you hear when you boot the game up? A single drop that leads into the cello piece, An Ancient Language. I think it's just beautiful. Hopefully I've given you enough information to know if you're interested in playing Heaven's Vault or not. I say this because I'm now going to explicitly spoil the story of Heaven's Vault to discuss the themes within it. If you want to play the game spoiler-free, click away now. I don't know anyone who's played it outside of Inkle's Discord, so if you do, please be my friend. To begin unraveling the answer to a seemingly simple question like why study history, we'll start at the University of Iox. Not only is it a center of learning, but one of the key pillars of the Ioxian Protectorate, the dominant political organization in Aaliyah's time that collects resources from surrounding moons as tribute. This protectorate is really a diminished version of the Holy Ioxian Empire, an entity which existed from between 580 to 350 years ago. At the center of both the Holy Ioxian Empire and the Protectorate is the state religion called the Loop. The Loop is the phrase history repeats itself played straight. To followers of the Loop Temple, there is no history in the sense that there is no past or future. There is only what happens now. The rivers, the robots which were found buried under the university, teleporter-like devices called hoppers and eyes, and the existing power structure of Ioxian dominance are all how the nebula was created. It was meant to be. It all just miraculously works. For followers of the Loop Temple, if your body is burned when you die, your soul returns to the rivers, and at some undetermined point, in an undetermined birth, you are reborn. You may not remember your other lives explicitly, but you are reborn. Your soul can be eternal. The rivers are eternal. Iox and its rightful power are eternal. The Loop is eternal. Learning of this devotion to the Loop, the player quickly realizes that Iox desires selective learning. Iox studies history, but only through the eyes of religion. For example, they only have one book in their library, the Chronicles of Mazwai, spread over hundreds of copies and organized by different subjects. This is the only book people are allowed to study because it views the nebula through the eyes of the Loop. To Ioxians, there is no need to uncover past empires, to understand why the nebula exists in the way it does, to find out where robots come from or who built them, because it goes against their worldview. I don't think it would be fair to universally condemn the Ioxians' view of time, but inside a society that holds so much technology, so many artifacts, the university's approach ends up limiting the nebula's collective knowledge. Aaliyah doesn't believe in the Loop. She grew up an orphan on the poorest moon in the Protectorate, Elbereth. In Mazwai's Chronicles, Elbereth is described as a worthless den of thieves, the lowest of the low. Aaliyah wants to understand how Elbereth came to be that way, because despite the reputation, it has grand architecture that suggests a more prestigious past. but for obvious reasons, no one on Iox is interested in supporting such a pursuit. This is a consistent point of tension between Aaliyah and her adoptive home. When you visit Iox, sometimes an NPC will stop to ask what you're doing, and it's readily apparent they think Aaliyah is wasting her time chasing artifacts and old inscriptions. When it comes to why Iox ever studies history, it's only to confirm what they already think, to bolster their beliefs, their mandate. To further seek answers, we need to talk about Mayari and Renba. When you begin searching for the missing roboticist, you track him to the middle of a violent set of rivers known as the Cyclones. There you find a secluded moon and a modest house containing, among other things, a gleaming crown hidden inside a chest. After exploring some more, you come across a burning wreck of a ship, and Renba is assumed to be dead. But more importantly, sorry Renba, you find out why he ventured into the boonies in the first place. On your way back to your ship, a pre-recorded message from Renba plays inside 6. There are a few revelations in this message, but among them Renba accuses Mayari of not being who she says she is. Depending on your dialogue choices, Aaliyah may already have an answer to this statement, but let's continue a little further first. When you get back to Iox, Aaliyah gets to ask Mayari some questions, specifically what Renba was doing in the Cyclones. Essentially, Mayari sent Renba to research the Fall, a mysterious event in which an unknown group of people only known as the Fallers appeared inside Iox out of nowhere and slaughtered everyone in sight around 350 years ago. It brought about the end of the Empire, and because time is cyclical for Lupists, Mayari needed Renba to find out what caused it so as to prevent it from happening again. Why? Well, probably because Mayari doesn't want to be murdered, but there almost seems to be a bit more to it than that, as Mayari will express an almost hungering interest in the crown that Aaliyah finds. That's because it's the crown of the Holy Ioxian Empire, lost alongside the last emperor of Iox during the Fall. It turns out that this last emperor fled to this remote moon, killed the hermit living there, and ended his days in solitude. Mayari wanted this crown because she purports herself to be the Emperor reborn, looking to restore the Holy Ioxian Empire in her name. To understand the Fall is to know how to prevent her new empire from suffering the same fate. But once Renba, a devout follower of the Loop Temple, found out the Emperor's body was never burned, he turned on Mayari and sent her the eagle-shaped brooch to lure her out to the very same moon. The eagle-shaped brooch was a keepsake of the Emperor, but Mayari sent you instead. For Iox, history is a way to tell the story of their people's ascension, the story of their religion, and thus the only history that matters is that which confirms those beliefs. For Mayari, the history of the crown and the empire could be used to prevent a cataclysm, but at the center of it all it is a tool to further her own power and prestige. Both answers to the questions, why study history and how to use it, as a means to an end. But neither one I resonate with, and as it happens, Aaliyah is just as skeptical of Iox and Mayari's views as I am. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. We should probably talk a little bit about Heaven's Vault. Before, I mentioned a recording that Renba stored inside 6, but I skipped over the most important revelation. Renba states that he's discovered a great darkness that will destroy the nebula, and that the only way to stop this darkness is to find an observatory. The robots know of its location, and have always known, but will not say. Therein lies the central conflict of this game, because Aaliyah soon discovers that this darkness is far from metaphorical. When Aaliyah visits Elbereth, eventually she will learn that the moon's water reserves are drying up, and in certain inscriptions she discovers that certain areas in the nebula, now mostly filled with clouds, used to be strong rivers. All this leads Aaliyah to realize that the darkness is the rivers themselves, which provide light as well as water, disappearing. As you travel across various forgotten places in search of the observatory, the phrase Heaven's Vault begins to appear more and more in your translations. Aaliyah soon realizes that this is the place Renba spoke of, and is the key to saving the nebula, but she also uncovers several revelations about the nebula's technological and societal history. Elbereth used to be at the center of the political world, culminating in the Steel Empire, led by robots who have been around since the very beginning of the nebula, and destroyed by someone who learned forgotten ancient command words that can be used to shut the robots down. As I said before, Ancient used to be spoken all across the nebula, and Aaliyah discovers that the people of Elbereth still retain some ancient words used in their own descended dialect, known as patois, coincidentally including the command to shut down robots, Slizet. Hoppers, which were already impressive as devices that were thought to be able to teleport someone in viewing range of the destination, can actually teleport you across moons without the need for ships. A more unsettling discovery is that the rulers of the Holy Ioxian Empire began transferring their memories into robot cores using a strategically broken hopper. It transports your mind as it is, but not your body, and kills you in the process. This was a tradition started by the first Empress of Iox to have a sort of monkey's paw way of living forever. Technically you're still here, but only a caricature of what thoughts and emotions the memories illustrate. You'll be obsessed with the desires and opinions imbued within them. With the exception of the last Emperor, all the rulers of the Holy Ioxian Empire were preserved in these cores, but only one was placed inside a robot's body. That one exception is inside your traveling companion. As it turns out, 6 contains the memories of the first Empress of Iox, she who toppled the Steel Empire and led Iox Ascendant to Elbereth's fall, the Eternal Empress, Enkei. Discovering this is optional, and you can reverse it before 6 is fully taken over by Enkei, but if you let it happen, you find out that she was actually the one behind the fall. That's right, she destroyed the very empires she created. It turns out Enkei ended up being locked away underground with all the other robots, and grew resentful that her empire forgot her, and thus led a revolt with enslaved miners and the other robots she once toppled. These forces were the Fallers. Enkei led them inside Iox, using the aforementioned ancient command words to shut down defenses, and afterwards she and the rest of the robots were betrayed and buried beneath Iox. Enkei also has an interest in stopping the darkness, but provides another ideological foil to Aaliyah's pursuit, because unlike Aaliyah, Enkei is only really concerned about preserving her sense of self, continuing her eternal life. The more and more the player finds out about the nebula, the more one has to wonder where exactly this all comes from, and why Aaliyah is living in a time where even the most learned individuals are still trying to understand technology and writing that has existed long before any of them were alive. The answer is found at Heaven's Vault. When you arrive, you discover Heaven's Vault is actually a derelict ship. Vault isn't even a term for a location. It's a verb to refer to some form of space travel. It's heavily implied in both the game and the books that to vault means to travel to another plane of existence. Essentially, in a far-off time and an entirely different place, this ship was built and manned by the ancestors of all who live in the nebula today. It's where robots, hoppers, and every other piece of seemingly inexplicable technology comes from. The ship vaulted into this plane of existence, and collided with the moon it now rests in. When it did this, its core burst open, and created the rivers from that energy, water, inside of it. Humans eventually used the technology from the ship to create new transports, traveling to and settling on the moons of the nebula. The robots sealed the entrance to Heaven's Vault, to protect the interests of those now living on the moons. These places would be destroyed should Heaven's Vault be used again, but the robots always remembered what it was and what it was used for. Ever since then, the ship's system has slowly been drawing all that energy back towards Heaven's Vault. This created the rivers. That pull from the core is what shapes them and makes them sailable, rather than a loose conglomeration of energy across all space. This also means that over millennia the rivers have been drying up. At the time of the game, the ship is finally finishing this process. However, because both the ship and robots were made to serve humans' commands, it needs just that to vault again. Thus, once Aaliyah reaches Heaven's Vault, whether it be with 6 or NK depending on your actions, the ship will ask the Overseer, Aaliyah, if they want to vault. If Aaliyah vaults, out of all the people living in the nebula, only she will survive. If she doesn't, the rivers will continue to dry up, almost certainly causing cataclysm in the near future. History repeats itself is a pretty popular phrase we use to describe a number of observations. Sometimes it's a joke about how there's a bizarre tendency for nearly identical situations to appear so many years apart, but oftentimes it's a cynical observation about how people make the same idiotic mistakes over and over again. But is that because we're truly destined to do so? Are we that stubborn? Or is it because we don't remember the lessons we need to learn? Iox will repeat the fall, because they became so engrossed in the loop that they forgot who founded it and why in the first place. NK admits she created the loop as a means for social control, but Ioxian society, high and low, has become so controlled by it that they fail to properly sense or react to danger, whether that be the inevitable revolt of the oppressed that crumbles empires, or the rivers drying up and stranding Iox, which relies on farming supplies sent by their subjects. The people of the nebula are seemingly doomed to watch the rivers dry up in front of them, the ship set to vault again, because those with the ability to control it forgot their own history. Heaven's Vault is something utterly inconceivable to the current generation of the nebula. Not only does it eclipse any technology they have, but it forces them to rethink their entire existence. It's almost a natural process, in the sense that the nebula itself spawned from this ship. Heaven's Vault is this world's Big Bang, and that same center of creation is now changing, destroying, the world these people live in, not because it is malicious, but because these were predestined functions built into the ship in an entirely different age and area of existence. The only true way to stop it is to understand the truth of where the nebula comes from, what makes the rivers, and why people live on scattered moons. The only person we see reach this understanding is Aaliyah. The only reason we uncover any of this information is because she pursued it. But why? Why does Aaliyah study history? Why does she spend all this time looking for Heaven's Vault? I haven't brought them up that much yet because I wanted to focus on the game, but the novel adaptations really delve into this aspect of Aaliyah's character throughout the journey. Obviously, Aaliyah has a greater moral and material incentive to find Heaven's Vault. The world she knows is threatened, first with an ominous darkness, then an actual mass extinction event. But Aaliyah pursued the past for years, decades, before the start of the game. Why? When asked what exactly she's looking for on her search, she gives this answer. I've always wanted to understand. Everyone else seems to be able to take things as they are, but I've never been able to do that. Whether it be due to a natural curiosity, or a deep sense of longing from growing up an abandoned child on the poorest moon in the nebula, Aaliyah seeks the truth above all else. And that's what makes history so thrilling. The wrong deductions, the blind oversimplifications, they're not failures, they're revelations waiting to happen. The truth has this property that makes the work of history possible. It endures. If one cuts and cuts, only the hard seeds of truth will remain. Through the thousands of years of history Aaliyah has witnessed over the course of her journey, empires toppled, places lost to obscurity, she understands the real loop. People settle, times change, they get up and they settle again. Sometimes the process is painful, sometimes one of practicality and safety, but this has built the places so many call home today and would continue to call home without interference. In the game, the decision is up to the player. Aaliyah can choose to vault. The screen cuts to black and that's the end of the game. In universe, only Aaliyah and Six or NK will know the truth if they vault and end this era of history. In fact, we're not even sure of their fate if they do. All we can do as the player is witness the events of the game and remember the lessons learned from it. Alternatively, Aaliyah can shut down the core's energy retrieval process and fill all the rivers once again. Lastly, she can simply walk away, content with an answer to a question and not wanting to disrupt something so much grander than herself. In either of these two endings, Six or NK will remain behind, Six seeking to interface with the ship more and attempt to better manage its control over the waters, NK seeking to re-establish her empire on Iox. However, in the novel, NK canonically has taken over Six, and is hell-bent on vaulting with or without Aaliyah's approval. She believes that to vault is to ascend to a higher, greater plane of existence. Naturally, she desires that. As a robot, she can interact with the ship's interface, and with the memories, or soul, of a human, she can command the ship and chooses to vault. Then, it seems that we witness multiple different eras of history passing us by, each a time where Aaliyah fails to stop NK from vaulting and destroying the nebula. But on the final cycle, Aaliyah, dubbed an Elberethian street rat by NK, uses the ancient word Slizet to silence both NK and Heaven's Vault itself. The same Slizet, among other command words, NK once used to topple Elbereth's empire to build her own. The same command words she attempted to have erased, alongside the entire language of Ancient, to prevent anyone from attempting to do what she had, what she would do later herself in The Fall. Aaliyah laments that all throughout this journey, people like Miari, NK, and Heaven's Vault itself have always been demanding, pushing forward without ever stopping to truly think about the consequences of their pursuits. It is in this quiet that Aaliyah decides to shut down the core's energy retrieval process and return the rivers to full strength. Aaliyah doesn't do it to pit Elbereth against Iox for another millennia, to become the queen of a moon, or to establish a new empire based on her own nationalist fiction. If Aaliyah used her understanding of the nebula's history to ensure that the ship vaults, what would she save but a metal husk filled only with mainframes? Heaven's Vault's purpose appears to have been a colony ship. That purpose has long been defunct. Aaliyah instead uses her understanding of spoken Ancient from her original home to command the ship to release the energy it's collected and shut down for good. Heaven's Vault is not of utmost importance anymore. The prosperity of everyone living in the nebula now is what matters. Why study history? To understand the truth. Whether that be of a society's rise and fall, the habitats that provide us with food and water and our interactions with them, the life of a simple farmer and how they retain their craft, it is all valuable. How do we use that understanding? To learn from any mistakes made along the way, and use that to better our efforts in the present and future. Aaliyah not only understands the nature, ebb, and flow of the nebula, but that vaulting is futile. While the nebula's waters may one day face danger in a far-off future, The decision that saves the most lives is to give water back to those currently living on it, to help those living now, and their children who will live after them. And that's why I really resonate with this game. I've always loved studying history. On a basic level, just thinking about the different ways people used to live and interact with each other and the world around them is fascinating to me. On a deeper level, I've been able to learn a lot about what's important in our own lives and empathizing with different perspectives through studying the lives and mistakes of those that came before, the flow of life on our planet and the universe as a whole. So it's frustrating to me when people cynically use the past for their own machinations, whether that be to spread propaganda and bigotry, ignore criticism, justify atrocity. All that only exists to satisfy someone's material desires, not to learn. We can study battle after battle, and the strategies and technology at play will always be fascinating. But if we don't remember the hell of war, then we will never truly learn why we should prevent bloodshed in the first place. If we forget the effects that we have on the environment, we will never truly learn how to best live on this planet. Aaliyah wants to understand the truth, for better or for worse. Perhaps it's a little simplistic of me to see my ideals regarding history in her, but I do. I'll end this video with the final words written in the novelizations, as I think they beautifully sum up the ideas I've been trying to get across in this video. I'd also just like to say thank you for watching. This is my first time making a project like this, but Heaven's Vault is a very special title for me. It just shows so much of what I value and love about studying history. So all I hope is that it proved a worthwhile way to spend your time. Stories don't have tidy beginnings. The past is always present. But the past is just another story, one told to us by ghosts, by voices long silent. What we do with that story, what we take into the future, and what we leave behind, that is for us to decide, and we must decide it together, for the future belongs to us all, for we are our future's ghosts.